The night had fallen over the Bronx, New York, like a thick, suffocating velvet curtain, covering the desolate streets still damp from the recent rain. The neon lights from small convenience stores flickered weakly, like lost fireflies adrift in a sea of darkness, their reflections shimmering in puddles, creating distorted streaks of light on the cold pavement. In this eerie silence, James Okoro, a 35-year-old black man from Nigeria, tall but gaunt, dragged his weary feet along the sidewalk. His tattered sneakers let out pitiful, slapping sounds, like the cries of a forgotten soul wandering a foreign city. James did not truly belong here. He was a traveler from the distant land of Lagos, where the scorching sun and dusty red winds swept through impoverished villages. 4 years ago, he had set foot in America with a fragile dream in his heart, a dream of a better life for the family waiting for him back home. But now, that dream had been worn thin by endless days spent in a dim warehouse, where he bent his back lifting heavy packages, his sweat soaking through his shirt, all for a few meager dollars to send across the ocean. The worn-out shoes on his feet were the remnants of those early days when he still hoped, still believed that America would embrace him as one of its own. Now, they were nothing but shredded fabric, with broken stitches resembling unhealed wounds, exposing his calloused feet to the biting cold of the rain-soaked night. He walked, his shoulders weighed down by the burdens of life, like an ancient tree battered by storms but still reaching toward the sky. Every step was a whispered testament to patience, to an unyielding determination, even as his eyes dimmed with exhaustion. The sound of his tattered shoes echoed through the empty streets, blending with the howling wind that swept past crumbling buildings, composing a mournful symphony of solitude. It was not just the sound of his shoes. It was the voice of James himself, the sound of a heart still beating despite being battered by life's relentless trials. He sighed, his breath turning into delicate white mist that dissolved into the freezing air, much like the dreams that once burned bright within him, now reduced to ashes. The Bronx at night was no place for dreamers. The narrow streets, riddled with cracks like the dried veins of a dying body, lay silent under the dim glow of flickering streetlights. A distant car horn echoed faintly, disjointed, like the call of a world James could never quite reach. He passed through shadowy alleyways, where the stench of damp garbage and cheap cigarette smoke lingered in the air, where figures drifted past without sparing each other a glance, like lost ghosts trapped in their own lives. His tattered shoes, the frayed fabric hanging like wilted petals, seemed to cry out for mercy, pleading against the unforgiving nature of a city that had no place for weakness. But James did not stop. He could not stop. Every step was an affirmation that he was still alive, still present, even if only as a faint shadow in the vast, indifferent city. That night, the rain had ceased, but the cold had seeped deep into his flesh, into his very bones. He pulled up his thin collar, a futile attempt to shield himself from the icy wind that swept in from the Hudson River. His hands, rough and scarred from long hours of hard labor, trembled as he tucked them into the pockets of his tattered coat, an almost hopeless effort to preserve the last remnants of warmth. His shoes were no longer shoes, but a mess of fabric and peeling rubber, disintegrating with every step, exposing his toes to the brutal, unforgiving chill. He closed his eyes for a moment, imagining himself standing beneath the golden sunlight of Lagos, where his mother once sang lullabies on the front porch, where his younger siblings had laughed and played. But when he opened his eyes, only the cold darkness of the Bronx remained, a cruel reminder that those dreams were now mere distant memories. James was not the kind of man to surrender easily. Though life had battered him relentlessly, He carried within him a small flame, the fire of patience, of love for his family, and of an unwavering belief that one day things would change. His tattered shoes, though on the brink of total ruin, stood as a testament to his resilience. They had journeyed with him through his hardest days, from the dusty red roads of Nigeria to the unforgiving concrete sidewalks of New York. He looked down at them, a faint smile flickering across his lips, a smile of resignation, yet also of quiet pride. "You've been with me for so long," he murmured, as if speaking to old companions, the last loyal witnesses of his lonely existence. But tonight, something in the air was different. As James passed a darkened street corner, where the weak street lamp barely illuminated the cracked pavement, he heard a sound. Neither the wind nor the hum of distant traffic, but something more fragile, something suppressed, like the muffled sob of someone in pain. He stopped, his breath quickening, his heart pounding against his ribs. His eyes scanned the shadows, and then he saw it. A small, trembling figure huddled under the dim glow of the streetlight, like a delicate flower beaten down by the storm. It was a little girl, her bare feet shaking, her arms wrapped tightly around herself in a desperate attempt to hold onto what little warmth she had left. James froze, as if time itself had halted. He did not know who she was or what had happened to her. But in that moment, something powerful stirred within him, an unstoppable force, a voice from the deepest corners of his soul, telling him he had to act. The dark night in the Bronx was more than just shadows. It was a curtain concealing untold stories. James stood there, his tattered shoes barely holding together beneath him, a reminder of all he had lost, but also a symbol of what he still had to give. He took a deep breath, his shaky exhale merging with the frigid air, his eyes glinting with something new, a spark of compassion, of silent courage, and of an unbreakable spirit refusing to yield to fate. He did not know it yet, but in that very moment, those battered shoes were about to become the beginning of an extraordinary journey, one where kindness would triumph over darkness, where hope would bloom through the cracks of a broken world. James stepped forward, slowly but steadily, his worn-out shoes letting out their final, weary sounds like a farewell. He no longer felt the cold, no longer thought of the pain in his feet. His entire focus was on that fragile figure before him, a lost soul in need of salvation, just as he had once been in his darkest days. The Bronx, with all its cruelty and bleakness, had unknowingly set the stage for a story about to unfold. A story of an ordinary man with nothing but a pair of broken shoes, yet possessing the heart of a hero. The dark night in the Bronx, New York, draped over every corner like an invisible cloak, heavy, cold, and suffocating. The narrow streets lay in an eerie silence. James Okoro, his worn-out shoes slapping against the pavement, stopped at a dimly lit street corner. His breath turned into thin white mist in the freezing air, vanishing like the dreams he once had. But then a sharp, chilling sound shattered the silence, a frail, trembling scream, like the wail of a lost soul trapped in a nightmare, echoing from the nearby subway station. His heart pounded, and his eyes widened in the darkness. James froze, his breath quickening, rough hands trembling in the pockets of his tattered jacket as he strained to listen, trying to distinguish the sound from the howling wind. It wasn't a car horn in the distance, nor the rustling of trash in the cold breeze. It was the sound of life, a life in danger, struggling in despair. He tilted his head, narrowing his eyes under the dim streetlight, and then he heard it again, a cry, small yet sharp like a knife, cutting through the Bronx's icy night, calling him, urging him forward. Without hesitation, James rushed toward the sound, his battered shoes striking the pavement with each determined step, his heart pounding in rhythm with his breath, which felt ready to burst from his chest. The subway station loomed ahead, a dark cavern swallowing the last traces of light, leaving behind only faint, flickering shadows under the weak glow of the street lamps. The air was thick with the metallic scent of rust and dampness, the wind whistling through the old rails like the whispers of forgotten souls. James slowed his pace, his soaked feet numbed by the cold seeping through his ruined shoes, but he ignored it, his gaze fixed on a horrifying scene unfolding under the dim, yellowish light. There, on the muddy sidewalk, a small, frail girl huddled on the ground, clutching a stack of lottery tickets as if holding onto the last shred of hope in her life. She couldn't have been older than 10, her tangled hair framing wide, tear-filled eyes. Two drunk men loomed over her like predators circling wounded prey. One, tall with a flushed face from alcohol, snatched the lottery tickets from her tiny hands, the sound of tearing paper slicing through the silence like an open wound. The other, a skinny man with clouded eyes, shoved her to the ground, sending her flimsy sandals skidding across the pavement. Her bare feet trembled in the biting cold. She sobbed, but the cries barely escaped her throat. Only weak, strangled sobs mixed with the men's hoarse laughter. Their laughter was cruel, like claws raking against the night, turning the train station into a living nightmare in the heart of the Bronx. James stood just a few steps away, his chest tightening under an invisible weight. He looked at the girl, her face frozen in terror, her tiny hands clutching the hem of her ragged dress as if holding onto the last ounce of strength. He didn't know her name, had never seen her before, but in that moment, he saw himself in her, saw the lost nights of his childhood in Nigeria, the hunger-filled days, the times he had begged for help and only met cold indifference. His battered shoes seemed to share his pain, whispering their own sorrow as they creaked beneath him. No matter how cruel life had been to him, he couldn't stand by and watch another innocent soul suffer. James's breath grew heavy, his chest rising and falling like a storm brewing inside him. The two men still hadn't noticed him, still engrossed in their sick game, their drunken laughter filling the empty streets. The taller man reached to snatch the girl's small bag, while the other kicked her sandals further into the shadows. The girl, whom James would later learn was named Sophia, lifted her tear-streaked face, eyes searching for help in the darkness, like a wounded bird lost in a raging storm. Her final scream, small but piercing, rang out once more, cutting through the night and driving straight into James's heart like a burning arrow. James took a step forward, his stance firm despite his ruined shoes barely holding together. The cold, the pain, the exhaustion from his long shift, all of it faded, replaced by a fire igniting in his chest. He wasn't a hero, not the strongest man around, but in that moment, he was a father, a brother, a soul that couldn't bear to see another suffer. Hey! His voice rang out, deep and commanding, like thunder rolling through the night, cutting through the cruel laughter. The two men turned, their bleary eyes locking onto him, but James didn't waver. His eyes burned with fierce determination, a fire fueled by compassion and courage, ready to face whatever came next to protect the small girl before him. The silent night near the train station was no longer still. Sophia's terrified scream had awakened something within James, something he thought had long died in the struggle of surviving the Bronx. He stood tall, alone yet unwavering, his tattered shoes a testament to resilience, to a heart that refused to surrender. He knew that what lay ahead wasn't just a confrontation with two drunk men. It was a test of fate, one that would change both him and the girl forever. That night, Under the dim glow of the street lamps, a story of kindness and salvation began to unfold in a city that seemed to have long forgotten the meaning of humanity. The dark night in the Bronx, New York, was no longer a silent curtain, but had turned into a small battlefield, where Sophia's terrifying screams still echoed in the freezing air near the subway station. James Okoro, his critically torn shoes making mournful sounds with each step, stood tall in the dim streetlight, his eyes burning like a flame erupting from the depths of his heart, facing two drunkards who were trampling on the last shred of hope of the little Guatemalan girl. His shout, "Hey!" rang out, deep and powerful like thunder, cutting through the cruel laughter of the two men, causing them to turn around, their clouded eyes staring in surprise at the tall man who dared to interfere with their frenzy. The two men, like beasts awakened from their drunken stupor, looked at James with a mixture of contempt and surprise. The taller one, with a flushed face and breath reeking of cheap alcohol, threw Sophia's tattered lottery tickets to the ground, the white scraps fluttering like butterflies crushed in the cold wind. "You blackie dare to interfere with my business?" he growled, his voice hoarse with hatred, his hands trembling with drunkenness, but still swiftly pulling a small knife from his pocket, the sharp blade flashing a deadly light in the yellow streetlight. The skinny one beside him sneered, his clouded eyes gleaming with cruelty, kicking Sophia's broken sandals again as an affirmation of their brutal power over her weakness. James didn't back down, even though his heart pounded as if it wanted to break out of his chest, even though the cold from his rain-soaked bare feet cut into his flesh through the torn shoes like 1,000 needles. He looked at Sophia, the little girl, now cowering on the sidewalk, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, her big round eyes filled with tears, reflecting extreme fear, but also a glimmer of hope as she saw him, the stranger who dared to stand up for her. In that moment, James saw himself in those eyes a lost boy in Nigeria, once bullied by stronger people, once crying out in vain under the scorching sun of his homeland. He gritted his teeth, his hands clenched into fists, not out of anger, but out of a silent vow in his heart. He would not let this little girl endure the pain he had experienced. The taller man lunged forward, the knife in his hand flashing like a silver lightning bolt in the darkness, aiming straight for James's chest with the intent to quickly finish off the one who dared to challenge him. But James, with the instinct of someone who had faced many dangers in his hard life, quickly leaned to avoid the fatal stab, the cold sensation of the blade slicing past his shoulder making his heart clench. Before the man could recover, James lunged forward, his rough, scarred hands from his hard days of work grabbing the man's wrist, using all his strength to wrench the knife from the drunkard's hand. The sound of metal hitting the sidewalk rang out sharply, mingling with the heavy breathing of both men, but blood was already seeping from James's hand, a deep cut from when he touched the sharp blade, flowing red down his torn shoes as a silent testament to his courage. The skinny man, seeing his companion overpowered, screamed in panic and charged at James, his thin arms flailing wildly in a frenzy. But James, despite his bleeding hand and sore bare feet on the cold pavement, stood firm like an unyielding mountain in a storm. He pushed the taller man down, then grabbed the skinny man's collar, his eyes flashing with a sacred anger, not the anger of hatred, but of someone protecting the weak from the cruelty of the world. "Enough!" he roared, his voice echoing through the cold concrete walls of the Bronx streets, making the skinny man flinch, his legs trembling as he backed away, his face pale in the streetlight. The two drunkards, no longer fierce beasts, were now just pathetic figures before James's spiritual strength. The taller one scrambled to his feet, his bloodshot eyes showing a hint of fear as he looked at James's bleeding hand, while the skinny one retreated into the shadows, his labored breathing mingling with the wind whistling through the old subway tracks. They cursed weakly, their voices faltering with fear and fading drunkenness, then finally turned and fled, their figures disappearing into the night like nightmares dispelled by the light of courage. James stood there, panting, blood dripping from his hand onto the sidewalk, mingling with the rain to form crimson streaks. But his eyes were no longer those of tired man. They were the eyes of a warrior who had just crossed the line between life and death. Sophia, from the muddy corner of the sidewalk, looked up at James, her tear-filled eyes now sparkling with a different light, the light of gratitude, of faith ignited in the darkness of despair. She said nothing, just hugged herself tightly, her small hands trembling as if trying to hold onto the miraculous moment that had just happened. James knelt beside her, his bare feet now numb with cold, blood from his hands soaking his torn shoes. But he didn't care, he just looked at Sophia, his voice hoarse but gentle like a lullaby. "Don't be afraid. Everything's all right." Those words, simple but warm, were like a spring breeze blowing through a dry field, bringing a little warmth to the cold, dark night of the Bronx. Under the yellow streetlight, the knife-edge encounter had ended, but the story of James and Sophia had just begun. The torn shoes, now stained with blood and rain, were no longer a symbol of poverty, but a testament to an indomitable heart, ready to sacrifice to protect the weak. James stood up, his shoulders still slumped, but his eyes shining the light of compassion, of courage, and of a soul that had just found meaning in the heart of this cold city. He didn't know that greater challenges awaited him, but in that moment, he had won one not only against the two drunkards, but against the darkness in his own life. The night in the Bronx, New York, had returned to silence, but the air remained heavy, pressing down on the desolate streets near the subway station like an iron curtain. James Okoro stood there, his breath escaping in shivering white puffs against the biting cold. Blood from the cut on his hand dripped onto the sidewalk, soaking into his already worn-out shoes, now on the brink of disintegration after the violent encounter with the two drunken men. Under the dim streetlight, his tall frame appeared both strong and lonely, his shoulders weighed down by the burdens of the world. Yet, his eyes still burned bright, with compassion and the triumph of having saved Sophia, the small Guatemalan girl who had just escaped the clutches of death thanks to his courage. Sophia sat curled up on the muddy pavement, her tiny arms wrapped tightly around herself, trying to cling to the last bit of warmth against the chilling wind sweeping in from the nearby Hudson River. Her cheap sandals, kicked away by the drunkard, lay abandoned in a dark corner, a painful reminder of how fragile her existence was in this unforgiving city. But when she looked up, her tear-filled eyes no longer reflected only fear. There was something new in them, a glimmer of gratitude and trust. As she gazed at James, the man with bloodied hands and tattered shoes, the man who had turned her nightmare into a small but extraordinary miracle. James knelt beside Sophia, his bare feet numb from the freezing, rain-slicked pavement, but he paid no mind to the pain searing through his body. He looked at her dirt-streaked face that still held the innocent beauty of a soul not yet entirely broken by the cruelty of life. In her eyes, he saw echoes of his younger siblings in Nigeria. Nights when he had held them close as hunger gnawed at their stomachs and the darkness of their homeland's cold nights wrapped around them like an invisible beast. He could not let Sophia endure another second of this suffering. He could not let her walk barefoot in the deadly cold of the Bronx, nor allow fear to keep her imprisoned. With slow but deliberate movements, James bent down, his trembling, bloodied hands untying the laces of his shoes. The fabric was frayed, the stitching broken, the soles worn thin. Now stained with his own blood, the shoes bore silent witness to a lifetime of struggles. He placed them gently before Sophia, his voice hoarse yet soft, like a lullaby whispered from the depths of his heart. Take these. Go home. Don't be afraid anymore. It's over now. His words were not merely reassurance. They were a promise, a lifeline cast into the sea of despair, offering warmth and hope to a little girl trembling in the darkness. Sophia hesitated, her small hands shaking as she reached for the tattered shoes, as if unable to believe that someone would give up their last possession for her sake. She looked up at James again, her eyes shining like lost stars in the vast night sky. And then, slowly, she put on the shoes. They were far too big for her tiny feet, flopping with each movement, but their awkward fit did not matter. The sound they made as she moved was not one of discomfort. It was the sound of safety, of kindness, of an outstretched hand that had pulled her away from the abyss without asking for anything in return. Sophia smiled, a faint but sincere smile, like the first flower blooming after a storm. And in that moment, James felt warmth spread through his chest, even as his own feet remained bare and vulnerable to the merciless Bronx cold. He stood up, his bare feet pressing against the icy pavement, each step like 1,000 needles piercing his skin. But he did not waver. His eyes remained fixed on Sophia as she walked away, her oversized shoes slapping against the ground in an oddly comforting rhythm. The blood from his wounded hand continued to drip, mixing with the rain into crimson streaks on the sidewalk. Yet, the pain was insignificant compared to the quiet solace in his heart. The knowledge that she was safe, that he had done what no one else in the dark of that night had dared to do. He raised a hand in farewell, a simple gesture, but one carrying an ocean of care. As Sophia turned back for one last glance, her eyes filled with an unspoken thank you, a small beacon of light in the city's suffocating night. The tattered shoes were no longer on James's feet, but they had fulfilled their purpose, not to protect him, but to protect someone more fragile. They were no longer just a symbol of poverty and hardship. They had become a testament to selfless kindness, to an unspoken sacrifice in a world that had forgotten the meaning of humanity. James stood under the flickering streetlight, his bare feet trembling in the cold, his bloodied hand clenched to stop the bleeding, but his heart was at peace. Light like the sky after a storm, when the first rays of dawn peeked over the horizon. The rain fell harder, its icy droplets seeping through his thin clothes, but James no longer felt alone. He watched as Sophia's figure disappeared into the distance, the sound of his worn-out shoes flapping against her small feet like a melancholic yet beautiful melody playing in the Bronx night. He knew that though those shoes were gone, they had carried away a piece of his heart, the part willing to give everything to trade for the safety of a little girl he had only just met. That night, in the unforgiving city, James had not only saved Sophia from 2 drunk men, he had saved himself. He had saved his belief that even in the cracks of a cruel world, kindness could still take root and bloom. Dawn broke over the Bronx, New York, like a faint streak of light filtering through the gray clouds. But the cold of the night still clung to the poor streets, seeping into every alleyway like an indelible curse. James Okoro trudged toward the warehouse where he worked as a daily laborer, his bare feet now trembling on the cold concrete, each step like 1,000 knives piercing his flesh, leaving streaks of dried blood from the cuts on his hands mingling with the rain-soaked thin socks, the last remnants that replaced the torn shoes he had given to Sophia. His figure was tall but unsteady, his shoulders slumped under the weight of an eventful night, Yet in his eyes burned a silent flame, the flame of resilience and the comfort that the little girl was now safe, even if he had to pay with his last means of protection. The warehouse loomed before him like an old fortress, its cracked, mottled walls standing stark in the suffocating space. The smell of machine oil and sweat mingling in the heavy air like a symphony of toil. James pushed the rusty iron door, stepping inside with numb bare feet, trying to hide his bleeding hands under his thin coat so no one would notice. He didn't want pity, didn't want curious eyes scrutinizing the wounds he brought back from the clash in the Bronx streets last night. He bowed his head, silently walked to his familiar work corner, where heavy packages awaited him to lift onto his thin shoulders. But in his heart echoed the clip-clop of torn shoes on Sophia's small feet that sound like a gentle lullaby, soothing the wounds not only on his body but also in his soul. But that fragile peace quickly shattered when Carlos, a Mexican colleague with a gaunt face and prejudiced eyes, approached James. He looked at him from head to toe, from the hastily hidden bleeding hands to the mud-caked bare feet, then let out a cold sneer, sharp as the knife that had threatened him the night before. "Blackie, barefoot, and still trying to be a hero?" Carlos growled, his words filled with contempt like a poisonous arrow aimed straight at James's self-esteem, causing some nearby colleagues to snicker, their laughter echoing in the cramped space of the warehouse like hammer blows to his heart. That insult wasn't just a sentence, it was an invisible wound, deeper than the cuts on his hands, a reverberation of the racial discrimination he had heard too much since setting foot in this country. James stood there, his cold bare feet seemingly rooted to the concrete floor, his hands clenched to suppress the trembling not just from the cold but from the pain surging in his chest. He wanted to shout, wanted to retort, but his lips were pressed together, his eyes lowered as if trying to hide the simmering anger, not anger at Carlos, but at a world that had labeled him black since he was a child in Nigeria. He remembered those distant days when the children in the village teased him for being poor, when the white people in Lagos looked at him as if he were invisible. And now, in the Bronx, Carlos's insult was like a final blow, cutting deep into the belief that he could find respect in this foreign city. But then, amidst the storm of contempt, a memory flashed in James's mind, the image of Sophia, the little girl with sparkling eyes of gratitude as he gave her his torn shoes in the cold rain. Her faint smile, the clip-clop of the shoes on her bare feet, and the light of hope in her eyes were like a beacon guiding him through the darkness of pain. He raised his head, not to retort to Carlos, not to argue, but to look straight at him. His eyes were no longer those of a humiliated man, but those of someone who had overcome the sharp knife, who had sacrificed his torn shoes to ensure the safety of another soul. Carlos's insult, no matter how venomous, could not extinguish the flame that Sophia had ignited in him, the flame of silent pride, of unwavering will in the face of all the cold winds of prejudice. Carlos, seeing James's lack of reaction, shrugged and turned away, his laughter gradually fading into the suffocating air of the warehouse. But his words left an invisible scar in James's heart. He bent down, lifted a heavy package onto his shoulder, his bare feet trembling under the weight. But he did not give, and each step was an affirmation that he had not only survived the dark night in the Bronx, but also the venomous insults of the world. He worked in silence, his bleeding hands staining his thin coat red, but in his heart, the image of Sophia with the clip-clopping torn shoes echoed like a song of kindness, of sacrifice, and of the belief that, no matter how harsh life was, he could still stand tall like an old tree in a storm, never yielding. The day passed in the warehouse, the faint light from the high windows shining down on the concrete floor, but the chill of racial discrimination still enveloped James like a lingering ghost. He said nothing, did not resist, But each breath was a silent challenge, a challenge to Carlos, to the contemptuous eyes, and to himself. The torn shoes had left him, but they left in him a new strength, the strength of compassion, of resilience, and of a soul that never succumbed to insults, whether they were as sharp as a knife or as cold as the Bronx night. The sun had set behind the old buildings in the Bronx, New York, leaving a gray sky like a funeral shroud over the desolate streets, where the chill of twilight permeated the air like a silent threat. James Okoro left the warehouse after a long day of silent work, his bare feet now aching on the concrete, each step a heavy breath mingling with the wind whistling through the dark alleys, where Carlos's insults still echoed in his mind like an unending, sad melody. His shoulders slumped under the weight of the packages and the pain from the cuts on his hands, but his eyes still shone with a resilient light, the light of an indomitable soul, even though the torn shoes had left him to ensure Sophia's safety, leaving him with thin, tattered socks and still bleeding hands. James's journey home was not a peaceful one. The small streets of the Bronx, with their mottled walls and crooked streetlights, were like snakes winding through the darkness, leading him through corners where light never reached. He walked, his cold bare feet stepping on broken glass and rusty cans, each small sound a reminder of the fragility of the life he was trying to hold on to. His breath turned into white smoke in the cold air, his hands deep in his thin coat pockets to keep the last bit of warmth. But in his heart, the image of Sophia with the clip-clopping torn shoes was still a small flame, warming his heart amidst the cold of this strange city. But then, in the deathly silence of the dark street, a shadow suddenly flickered in the corner of James's eye, quick as a toxic gust of wind carrying the scent of danger. He stopped, his breath quickening, his ears straining to listen silent, but hurried footsteps came from behind, mingling with the panting of those lurking in the shadows. Before he could turn around, two familiar figures from the night before appeared, the two drunkards he had chased away from the subway station, now back with faces flushed with hatred and eyes clouded with cruelty. The tall one growled, "You think you could escape me, Blackie?" His voice as sharp as the knife that had threatened James before, while the skinny one sneered, his trembling hands holding a broken piece of wood, ready to attack and avenge the humiliation James had inflicted on them. James had no time to think. The tall one lunged forward, the skinny one swinging the wooden stick like a whirlwind, aiming straight for James's head with the intent to finish off the one who dared to stand in their way. James leaned to avoid the fatal blow, but the stick struck his shoulder hard, the dry sound of cracking bone making him grit his teeth in pain, his bare feet slipping on the wet pavement, almost making him fall. The tall one didn't stop, his hands grabbing James's collar, pulling him into a dark corner near a mottled wall, while the skinny one kicked him hard in the leg, their hoarse laughter mingling with the whistling wind like a symphony of brutality, turning the dark street into a bloody arena in the heart of the Bronx. But James didn't give in. Though his shoulder ached, though his bare feet bled from fresh cuts, he still surged forward with the strength of a cornered beast. He pushed the tall one away, using all his might to punch him straight in the flushed face, the sound of a broken nose echoing like a liberating sound in the night. The skinny one screamed, charging with the wooden stick, but James grabbed his arm, twisting it sharply, making the stick fall to the ground, then pushed him crashing into the wall, his labored breath mingling with painful groans. The blood from James's hands flowed more freely, staining his torn socks red, dripping onto the pavement, but his eyes didn't waver. They were the eyes of someone who had faced a sharp knife, sacrificed his torn shoes, and was now ready to fight to defend his own life. The two men, now pathetic like fading ghosts, scrambled to their feet in panic. The tall one clutched his face, blood seeping through his fingers, his bloodshot eyes showing a hint of fear as he looked at James, not a weak, barefoot man, but an indomitable mountain in a storm. The skinny one retreated, his legs trembling, cursing weakly before dragging his companion away, their figures disappearing into the dark alley like nightmares vanishing before the light of courage. James stood there, panting, his bare feet trembling on the cold pavement, blood from his hands and shoulder mingling with the dirt to form crimson streaks. But he didn't collapse. He stood tall, like an old tree felled by a storm but still reaching its bare branches toward the sky. Stopping to catch his breath under a crooked streetlight, James leaned against the cold wall, his eyes closed to suppress the pain screaming in his body. He thought of Sophia, of the clip-clopping torn shoes on her small feet, and a smile flickered across his lips, a smile of resignation, but also of pride. This bloodied ambush was not just a test of fate, it was proof that, even without shoes, even when insulted and attacked, he was still a warrior, a soul that would never succumb to the darkness of the Bronx. He took a deep breath, his trembling breath mingling with the cold air, and told himself that he had to keep going not just for himself, but for the little girl who had taken his torn shoes and walked into the night. The dark street was now silent again, with only the wind whistling through the alleys and James's labored breathing echoing in the space. He stood up, his bleeding bare feet stepping forward, each step a challenge to fate, a challenge to those who had tried to bring him down, to Carlos's insults, and to the coldness of this city. That night, in the harsh heart of the Bronx, James not only survived the bloodied ambush, he affirmed that, even though the torn shoes had left him, his heart still beat strongly, ready to face any storm ahead. The darkness of the Bronx, New York, was no longer a silent shroud, but had transformed into a stormy ocean, where dark clouds churned like giant waves, growling threats across the sky. James Okoro trudged through the dark streets after the bloodied ambush, his bare feet bleeding from fresh cuts, each step like a knife stabbing into his flesh. But he didn't stop. His thin shoulders trembled under the biting wind, blood from his hands and shoulder, soaking his thin coat, mingling with the dirty water on the pavement to form tragic crimson streaks. In his heart, the image of Sophia with the clip-clopping torn shoes was still a small flame, burning brightly amidst the storm of pain and danger, urging him to continue, not to return home, but to bring a small yet sacred gift to the little girl who had stirred compassion within him. Before the storm hit, James had stopped by a second-hand shop in Harlem, where dim light from the window shone on old items covered in the dust of time. With the meager money saved from his hard days of work, he asked Marek, the Polish owner with a gaunt face and cold eyes, to repair an old pair of sneakers that the shop was about to throw away, smaller shoes, a better fit for Sophia, no longer clip-clopping like the torn shoes he had given her the night before. "So poor, why not go back to your country?" Marek sneered, his voice dry as the wind blowing through the desert. But James only smiled slightly, his eyes shining with unspoken determination. "I'm here to live, not to get rich." Marek shrugged, reluctantly repaired the shoes for a low price, and even slipped a new pair of socks into his hands to keep warm, a small but unexpected gesture in the heart of this cold city. Now, as the sky began to rumble with thunder like the drums of a war god, James clutched the repaired shoes tightly in his hands, walking through the heavy rain that poured down like 1,000 silver arrows piercing the space. The rain lashed at his face, as cold as Carlos's insults, as the blows of the two drunkards. But he didn't waver. His trembling bare feet stepped on the flooded pavement, each step a silent vow that he would bring this gift to Sophia, no matter how hard the storm raged. He remembered the address of the housing project that the little girl had whispered in the dark 2 blocks ahead, not far, but with bleeding feet and bone-chilling cold. That road was like a final test that fate had set to test his resilience. The storm reached its peak when James arrived at the housing project, a row of low buildings standing precariously in the white rain, the lights from the small windows like tired eyes looking out at the world. Lightning split the sky, illuminating his face, a face smeared with mud and dried blood, but his eyes still shone like a lighthouse in a stormy ocean. He knocked on Sophia's apartment door, his hands trembling with cold and exhaustion, his labored breath mingling with the howling rain outside. The door opened, and Elena, Sophia's mother, appeared, a small woman with wary eyes, startled to see the tall man standing at her door, his bare feet bleeding and his hands clutching a small, soaked package. "Who are you?" Elena asked, her voice trembling, her hands gripping the door's edge as if ready to slam it shut at any threat. But then Sophia appeared from behind, her big round eyes lighting up when she recognized James, and she exclaimed, "Mom, it's him. He saved me last night." Elena hesitated, her eyes shifting from suspicion to surprise, then softening as she listened to Sophia's quick account of the man who had given her his torn shoes in the midst of her nightmare at the subway station. James bent down, his voice hoarse, but warm like a spring breeze blowing through a dry field. "I brought this for you. It fits better than the old ones." He handed over the repaired shoes, raindrops dripping from his bleeding hands. But the gentle smile on his lips was like light dispelling the darkness of the storm. Sophia received the shoes, her small hands trembling as she hugged them like a treasure, her eyes sparkling as she looked at James, not just the man who had saved her from the two drunkards, but also the one who brought warmth in the storm of her life. Elena burst into tears, her thin shoulders shaking as she looked at the barefoot man standing at her door, blood and rain soaking his coat, but his heart still shining like an inextinguishable flame. "I don't know how to thank you," she choked, her voice breaking in the rain. "You're so good to her, even though you have nothing." James waved his hand, his smile simple but profound. "I was poor too. Seeing her reminded me of myself as a child, that's all." The storm still raged outside, lightning splitting the sky as if trying to tear apart the night. But in the small apartment of the housing project, a warmth spread between the three strangers. James stood there, his bare feet cold, his bleeding hands trembling. But his heart was light like the sky after the rain. The gift of shoes amidst the storm was not just a pair of shoes, but a promise, a connection between him, Sophia, and Elena, souls as lost as he was in the harsh Bronx. He watched Sophia hug the shoes, her eyes shining like lost stars, and he knew that, even though the torn shoes had left him, his kindness would continue its journey, a journey to bring hope in the darkest days. James turned to leave, the rain still lashing at him like 1,000 needles. But he no longer felt cold. His bare feet stepped on the flooded pavement, each step a breath of resilience, of unwavering compassion. That night, amidst the peak of the storm, James didn't just give away a pair of shoes, he gave away his heart. And in the cold of the Bronx, he found a new light, the light of humanity, of sharing, and of a soul that had overcome all trials to sow seeds of hope in the midst of the tempest. The peak of the storm in the Bronx, New York, gradually subsided, leaving a silent but still heavy night, where the last raindrops fell from the housing project's roof like belated tears from the gray sky. James Okoro stood before Sophia and Elena's small apartment, his cold bare feet trembling on the rotting wooden floor, blood from his hands dried into crimson streaks mingling with the rain-soaked thin coat. But the gentle smile on his lips was like a spring breeze blowing through a dry field, dispelling the cold of the dark night after giving the repaired shoes to the little Guatemalan girl. In his eyes, there was no longer the pain of the bloodied ambush or the venomous insults at the warehouse, only the silent comfort that Sophia now had a pair of well-fitting shoes, a small step on her journey out of the darkness where he had once been lost. Sophia hugged the new shoes tightly, her big round eyes sparkling like lost stars in the gloomy night sky, looking at James with a gratitude that went beyond words. She no longer cowered in fear like she did at the subway station, but stood there like a small flower just blooming after a storm, her tiny hands trembling as she touched the shoes as if holding a sacred treasure, not just a gift, but a symbol of the kindness that had saved her from the sharp knife and the deadly cold of the Bronx. Elena, her mother, her thin shoulders still trembling with emotion, quickly wiped away the tears on her gaunt face, her voice choked up. "You're too good to her. I don't know how to repay you." James waved his hand, his voice hoarse but warm. "You don't have to. Ma'am, seeing her safe is enough for me." But Sophia, with her innocent childlike heart and eyes shining like a flame of hope, didn't want James to leave empty-handed. She ran quickly to the corner of the room, where the stack of lottery tickets, the family's fragile lifeline, lay scattered on the old wooden table, and took out the last ticket, the one she had kept from yesterday, not yet sold. With a radiant smile like the first rays of sunshine after the rain, Sophia pressed the ticket into James's hand, her clear voice ringing out in the shabby room. "I'm giving you this, your lucky lottery ticket. I hope you win big." James laughed, his deep, warm laughter like a gentle melody echoing in the cramped space, taking the ticket with his bleeding hands, his eyes shining with surprise and emotion at the small gift that contained an ocean of love from the little girl. James left the housing project, his bare feet stepping on the still wet street after the storm, the lottery ticket in his hand like a fragile white butterfly, carrying Sophia's simple wish amidst the cold of the Bronx. He didn't place much hope in it his life, with its hard days in Nigeria and dark nights in New York, had never been a fairy tale with magic. But as he walked, his sore bare feet stepping on the cold pavement, he felt a strange warmth from the ticket, not for its material value, but because it was the first gift he had received from a grateful heart, a small soul he had pulled out of the darkness with his own torn shoes. A few days passed. James continued his hard work at the warehouse, his bare feet now used to the cold of the concrete floor, but the wounds on his hands and shoulders still throbbed every time he lifted a package. Sophia's lucky lottery ticket lay quietly in his pocket, forgotten amidst the long days of fatigue and the still echoing insults from Carlos. But one afternoon, when a rare ray of sunshine shone through the warehouse window, James accidentally heard a colleague reading the lottery results from an old newspaper. Familiar numbers rang out, matching perfectly with the ticket in his pocket. He stood still, his hands trembling as he pulled out the ticket, his eyes squinting to check each digit, and then his heart pounded as if it wanted to break out of his chest. The ticket had won a small prize, not a fortune, but enough for him to buy a new pair of shoes, enough for him to no longer have to walk barefoot in the harsh cold of the Bronx. James ran to the housing project that very evening, the winning ticket in his hand like a new flame of hope, his bare feet still stepping, but his heart light as the sky after a storm. When Sophia opened the door, he laughed loudly, a rare, deep, warm laugh echoing in the shabby room, and told the story of her lucky ticket. "You were right, I really won," he said, his eyes shining as he looked at Sophia, while she cheered, her little hands clapping together like a fledgling bird spreading its wings in the light. Elena stood beside them, her eyes sparkling with tears, smiling at the small miracle her daughter had brought to the man who had sacrificed everything for them. That night, James sat under the yellow streetlight near the housing project, the new shoes bought with the winnings lying next to him, no longer clip-clopping, no longer torn, but he still felt his old torn shoes were more precious. The winning lottery ticket was not just a material reward. It was proof that the kindness he had given had returned, not in gold and silver, but in new hope amidst the darkest days. He looked up at the sky, where the stars twinkled like Sophia's eyes, and felt a warmth spread through his heart, the warmth of humanity, of sharing, of a soul that had found light in the darkness thanks to a little girl and a lottery ticket named Lucky. James stood up, put on the new shoes, his feet no longer cold, but his heart still pounding with memories of Sophia and Elena. He knew that no matter how harsh life was, no matter how cold the Bronx was, he was no longer alone because somewhere in this city, a little girl was wearing the shoes he had given her, and a lottery ticket had connected them with an invisible but strong thread. The dark night of the Bronx was now not just darkness, it was a stage for small miracles, where kindness bloomed in the cracks of life, bringing new hope to James, to Sophia, and to other lost souls. The dark night in the Bronx, New York, was no longer a gloomy curtain covering the poor streets, but had transformed into a starry sky, where the yellow streetlights illuminated the corners that had witnessed intertwined pain and hope. Many years had passed since James Okoro received the lucky lottery ticket from Sophia. The new shoes bought with the winnings now worn out through his tireless days of work, but his heart still beat strongly with the memory of the little girl and the simple kindness he had given amidst the peak of the storm. He was now a security guard at a small supermarket on the outskirts of the Bronx, still tall, but with graying hair, his rough, scarred hands telling the story of the dark nights he had overcome not just to survive, but to sow seeds of hope in the heart of this cold city. Time, like a silent river, swept everything away, but could not erase the invisible thread connecting James with Sophia and Elena. The cold, barefoot days, the venomous insults from Carlos, and the bloody clashes were now distant memories, giving way to a simple but fulfilling life, not rich, but full in James's heart whenever he remembered Sophia's smile under the streetlight that night. He had not seen her again after telling her about the winning lottery ticket, but his every step on the Bronx streets still echoed the clip-clop of the torn shoes he had given away, like a gentle lullaby reminding him that kindness never disappears, it just quietly blooms in the hidden corners of life. One winter evening, as the cold wind blew through the dark alleys, James stood under the familiar streetlight near the supermarket, his eyes filled with sadness as he watched the hurried passers-by, no one noticing the old security guard with worn shoes and a pensive gaze. But then, a small figure approached from afar, white sneakers gently touching the sidewalk, and as the streetlight shone on that face, James was startled. It was Sophia, no longer the cowering girl with bare feet that night, but a young woman with her hair tied high and eyes shining like the stars he remembered. She stood before him, her smile as radiant as the first sunshine after the rain, and in her hand was a small gift box, carefully wrapped in blue paper, the color of hope, the color of unfading gratitude. "Mr. James, I've been looking for you," Sophia said, her voice clear, but now with the tone of maturity, of a soul that had grown from the darkest days. She recounted that after that fateful night, James's kindness had not only saved her from the two drunkards and the deadly cold, it had inspired her to study, to become a social worker, bringing light to the poor children in the Bronx neighborhood, as he had done for her. "You gave me shoes, but more than that, you gave me the belief that life was still worth living." She choked, her eyes sparkling with tears as she remembered the days when she and her mother were desperate, thinking that no one in the world cared about them. James stood still, his rough hands trembling as he heard those words, his heart stopping for a moment, then beating stronger than ever, not from fatigue, but from a simple but profound joy surging in his chest. Sophia opened the gift box. Inside was a brand new pair of shoes, not torn, not clip-clopping, but perfectly fitting his feet, chosen with all her love for the man who had sacrificed everything for her. This is my gift to you. You deserve it, and I swear under this streetlight, I will continue to bring your kindness to others, Sophia said, her voice ringing out like a sacred oath, like a bell ringing in the night, illuminating a corner of the cold Bronx. James took the shoes, his hands trembling as he touched the soft leather, his eyes blurred with tears, not raindrops, but the rare tears of a man who had thought his life was just an endless chain of dark days. He looked at Sophia, the young woman now taller, stronger, but still carrying the light he had seen in her eyes that night, the light of hope, of gratitude, of the power of kindness that had spread from a pair of torn shoes to a whole generation. He smiled, a gentle smile like a spring breeze blowing through a dry field, and said softly, "You make me so proud these shoes are not just a gift, they are my whole life in them." Under the yellow streetlight, James put on the new shoes, his feet no longer cold, no longer sore, but his heart warmer than ever warm with the knowledge that the kindness he had sown that night had blossomed into a brilliant flower in Sophia's life. The young woman stood beside him, her eyes shining like a lighthouse guiding through the darkness. And her oath under the streetlight was not just a promise, it was proof of the immortal power of humanity, the power that had turned a barefoot man with torn shoes into a flame that warmed this poor neighborhood. James looked up at the sky, where the stars twinkled like Sophia's eyes, and felt a warmth spread through his heart, the warmth of connection, of compassion, of a soul that had found meaning in the cracks of life. That night, the streetlight not only illuminated the Bronx street, it illuminated a journey. From blood-stained torn shoes to a brand new pair. From a lonely man to a young woman carrying an oath to spread kindness. James walked, the new shoes comfortable under his feet, but he knew that the torn shoes of the past were still the most precious gift he had ever given, a gift that not only saved Sophia, but also saved him, saved the belief that in the harshest darkness, kindness could still bloom, could still light up a world. And under that streetlight, James and Sophia, two lost souls, stood together, writing the final chapter of a beautiful story, where the power of kindness overcame all storms, forever spreading in the heart of this cold city. The story Lucky Lottery Ticket After the Battle Under the Streetlight is not just the journey of James Okoro, a poor Nigerian man lost in the harsh heart of the Bronx, but also a poignant ballad about kindness, sacrifice, and the power of humanity amidst life's darkness. From blood-stained torn shoes to pristine new ones, from the terrifying screams at the subway station to the sacred oath under the streetlight, the story paints a vivid picture of how compassion can bloom in the cracks of poverty, racism, and violence. James, with his cold, bare feet and warm heart, transformed brutal trials, the knife edge encounter, the venomous insults, the bloody ambush, and the stepping stones leading him to a higher meaning, saving not only Sophia, but also himself. The profound meaning of the story lies in the perfect circle of kindness. The torn shoes he sacrificed to ensure Sophia's safety were not just an object, they were a symbol of sharing, of silent courage in the face of adversity. The lucky lottery ticket that Sophia gave back, though only a small win, became a new flame of hope for James, lifting him from the cold, barefoot days. And then, years later, when Sophia grew up and returned with new shoes and an oath to spread kindness, the story concluded with an immortal message. Kindness, no matter how small, can sow seeds of hope, bloom into brilliant flowers in the desert of pain, spreading through time and space. The Bronx, with its dark streets and yellow streetlights, is not just a setting, it is a living character, representing a cold world where kindness seems to have been buried under layers of indifference and violence. But through James and Sophia, the story affirms that even in the harshest darkness, A small ray of humanity is enough to light up a whole sky, a sky of hope, of connection, and of the strength to overcome all storms. The meaning of the story does not lie in a fairy tale happy ending, but in that arduous journey, a journey that proves that kindness is never in vain, but always finds a way to return, like a circle of destiny, to heal the wounds of both the giver and the receiver. From a moment James Okoro gave his torn shoes to Sophia in the cold night under the subway station, we realize that kindness, as small as a grain of sand in the desert, can sow a seed of eternal life. That simple act not only saved the Guatemalan girl from the deadly cold and extreme fear, but also ignited a flame of hope in her, so that years later, Sophia grew up and spread that kindness to other poor children in the Bronx neighborhood, like a flower blooming in barren soil. This lesson teaches us that every kind gesture is a seed that can silently grow, transcend time and space, to illuminate the dark corners of life. James, with his trembling bare feet and bleeding hands, stood up in the darkness of the Bronx to face the sharp knife, overcome the bloody ambush, and trudge through the storm just to protect Sophia, a stranger he had never met. His courage was not the absence of fear, but the burning flame in his heart, urging him to act despite the danger, for something greater than himself, for compassion, for humanity. This lesson is like a lighthouse in a stormy ocean, reminding us that true courage is when we step across the line of fear to protect the faint light of lost souls. The torn shoes, the last thing protecting James from the harsh cold, were taken off and given to Sophia without any calculation, so that she could walk safely in the heavy rain of the dark night. That sacrifice, seemingly a loss, opened a series of simple miracles, from the winning lottery ticket that brought him new shoes to the pristine shoes Sophia gave back after many years, like a circle of destiny of kindness. The lesson from this act is a profound truth. When we give with our hearts, we do not lose, but find the sacred meaning of life, and sometimes receive precious gifts from the very people we have saved. The venomous insults of Carlos in the warehouse, the sarcastic voice of Merrick in the second-hand shop, and the contemptuous eyes of strangers could not break James's spirit, even though he was just a poor black man lost in a strange America. He chose silence in the face of prejudice, but his act of saving Sophia, a Guatemalan girl of a different skin color and background, and being reciprocated with sincere gratitude, proved that humanity is a solid bridge that crosses all boundaries of discrimination. This lesson is like a gentle lullaby in a storm, reminding us that in a world full of division, kindness is an invisible but strong thread that connects seemingly distant souls. From the terrifying screams at the subway station to the yellow streetlight, where Sophia swore to spread kindness, the story is a testament that hope never dies, no matter how thick the darkness of poverty, violence, and loneliness. The winning lucky lottery ticket, the new shoes from Sophia, and the little girl's smile in the shabby room are small but brilliant rays of light, piercing the cold night of the Bronx to guide James and those around him. This lesson is like a spring breeze blowing through a dry field, affirming that with just a little kindness, whether it's a pair of torn shoes or a word of comfort, hope will always find a way to sprout, illuminating the darkest days. James's act of giving his torn shoes not only changed Sophia's life, but also changed him, and through her, that kindness spread to the whole neighborhood like ripples on a still lake. From a barefoot man with torn shoes, he became an inspiration for Sophia to grow up, bringing light to other children, turning a small gesture into a powerful chain reaction, igniting hope in the hidden corners of the Bronx. The final lesson is a sacred whisper. Seemingly ordinary things, a pair of shoes, a lottery ticket, a smile when given with the heart, can create a spreading power that far exceeds all imagination, beautifying a world full of cracks.